Sure, like many people, Putin has filmed himself congratulating Donald Trump. He actually went overboard with the very positive comments. That's the first thing. Second thing is Trump has always said he's going to fix the Ukraine war in 24 hours. It's 24 hours. Not much has changed as far as I can see. As we said earlier, sometimes you just got to say to yourself, well, you take Trump seriously, but not literally. So still a complex situation. What do you think is going on in Putin's mind? Can we learn anything from his speech? And what do you think Trump's up to?
Again, this is one of those real big ones for me, because I've been sort of commentating on the war with Sky News and others for nearly 3 years now. And it's not really obvious to me how you bring this to an end. It will ultimately be a negotiated end, but what influence does Trump actually have? I think one of his rhetoric, I'll solve this in 24 hours, clearly was not possible. In fact, most of his people are saying it's going to take at least 100 days. He's also sounded, with some of the pre-rhetoric, almost critical of Zelensky and much more positive about Putin. So here's what President Trump had to say when he was actually signing some of these executive orders.
Zelensky wants to make a deal. I don't know if Putin does. He might not. I don't know. He should make a deal. I think he's destroying Russia by not making a deal. I think Russia's going to be in big trouble. You take a look at their economy. You take a look at the inflation in Russia. So I would hope. I got along with him great, and I would hope he wants to make a deal.
So I think what you're seeing there is he's going to end up with a carrot and stick. He's going to be ending up with going, what are the things that Putin will need? His economy is taking a big hit, and. So that gives a hint as to where an olive branch that President Trump might be able to offer. What's not evident is what the stick is, because what influence does Donald Trump have in terms of stopping Russia? He could actually step up military involvement. It's not entirely clear that he's happy to do that. And I think if you look at it from a Putin perspective, he probably knew that Biden had no appetite for war, that actually lots of things were taken off the table early and it was all about sanctions. I think Trump's unpredictable enough that that Putin will go, I'm not sure where this is going to go. And I wouldn't be sure that Trump wouldn't overreact and potentially get involved militarily. So I think we're seeing Putin, we've said before, he's pushing hard on the battlefield. He has taken more ground. It's pretty clear. And I think there's some really interesting conversations that we've got another clip here of what Trump said about Russia and NATO.
Long before Putin said you could never have NATO involved with Ukraine. Now, they've said that. That's been written in stone. And somewhere along the line, Biden said, no, they should be able to join NATO. Well, then Russia has somebody right on their doorstep, and I could understand their feeling about that. But there were a lot of mistakes made in that negotiation. And when I heard the way that Biden was negotiating, I said, you're going to end up in a war. And it turned out to be a very bad war. And it could escalate. That war could escalate to be much worse than it is right now. They can never join NATO.
Why I think this clip's important is because one thing that we haven't really talked much about in the West is that if Ukraine was to join NATO, it puts NATO right up against Russia's border. Why does that matter? Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis was actually brought about because the Soviet Union was looking to mount missiles right on America's border. And America very nearly launched into nuclear war because of that. So it would be somewhat hypocritical, I think, not to recognise the threat that having NATO on your doorstep would be. And I think that's what Trump's doing. He's trying to reach out to President Putin to make sure that he recognises some of Putin's potential red lines, but also be pretty clear about what might happen if the war doesn't come to a close. I mean, I'm still somewhat sceptical about, if I was Putin, whether I would draw this to a halt, but I'm pretty clear that the from the economy perspective, Putin needs to get this to an end. From a manpower perspective, he's lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, either killed or injured. That is not sustainable in the longer term. So he might be looking for an off-ramp. I suspect Trump will offer him that off-ramp. It's just a question of what the terms are.
Yeah, when you're anticipating a negotiation, one of the things you do is you send the other party indirect messages before you actually sit down at the table, as a way of softening them up or warming them up, creating some sort of balance in their mind. Maybe what I detect from what you've just said, Sean, is that little clip you've just shown is Trump actually talking to Putin.
I absolutely believe it is. I mean, I think all of these, as we've said, this is, what Trump is giving an idea of his intent, how it comes about. But he clearly wants to bring the war to an end. And I'd be really interesting to see how that happens. I think one thing that I'm uncomfortable with is that the whole conversation doesn't include Ukraine or President Zelensky.
Yeah. Well, I remember you saying many, many, many moons ago, Sean, when we covered this, because we were sort of, I've been anticipating this for a long time. You said slightly unkindly, when Trump and Putin were going to sit down together, and they said to Zelensky, would you mind waiting outside, please?
And it's metaphorical, but there is a danger that this conversation is about stopping Putin. And to be brutally honest, you don't get a ceasefire unless one side's lost, the other side's won, or they're both ground to a halt. That is not the case at the moment. Putin is still on the front foot. So why would he stop?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that has to happen, a leadership in Ukraine has to be established. I'm not saying it's not Zelensky, but this is a moment when that leadership is reevaluated. And you could argue that all sides have to be comfortable with the new leadership. So there could be all sorts of other games being played as well, which is all to do with the future of Ukraine.
I agree. And my own perspective of this is, I think that probably the one thing that will be a sticking point is that President Putin will not want to have anything put in place that will stop him revisiting offensive action if he wants to, because he wants to subjugate the whole of Ukraine. Will get on to other strategies he's got, particularly around Belarus, which he does appear to be taking without being by force, but by other means at the moment. And therefore, whereas President Zelensky he might have to cede ground. He's already talked potentially about that. What he has to guarantee is that what's left of Ukraine is sovereign and will remain sovereign, and there's a way of keeping it sovereign into the future. And I think that is going to be the big sticking point. And I suspect that seasoned negotiators will probably go, we don't have to agree that day one. What we have to agree is that at least the building blocks of that, it remains unresolved. But over time, as tempers soften, it might well be that the West is able to bolster Ukraine's defensive capability without it necessarily provoking Russia, but we'll have to wait and see. I think what's fascinating about all of this as well, though, is that there's another clip from Trump. I know we're using a few of these, but frankly, there's been a lot of interesting work. This is what Trump had to say about NATO and particularly about spending.
In a true sense, I saved NATO, but NATO's taken advantage of us. And one of the problems that I have, and I've said it openly, I said it to President Zelensky, Europe is in for a tiny fraction of the money that we're in. Now, whether you like that situation or not, Europe is much more affected than the United States. We have a thing called the ocean in between us, right? Why are we in for billions and billions of dollars more money than Europe?
Now, apart from the rhetoric that Trump has saved NATO, what he's also really making clear is that, that the legacy of spending 2% on defence for Europe isn't enough. He's very clear Europe needs to step up to the plate. He's very clear that there's an ocean between America and Russia. It's on Europe's doorstep. And I think he's got a point here. But it'd be very interesting to see how that actually affects Europe. We're in one of the countries in Europe that pay more than a lot of others, but we're not even halfway to 5%. Is this, as you've often suggested, a way of getting us up to 3%, stretch it really hard, or is it saying, no, a new set of terms will be put on the table, and America will pull out of NATO unless NATO pays its way. And frankly, I think NATO, it's long overdue, that sort of approach.